everybody, to our November Sol Speaker Series. I'm Fleet Captain Barb Barton and Director of Sciences here at Starfleet, and I am really excited for our guest today. Tyler Bassett works for Michigan Natural Features Inventory here in Michigan. He's a botanist, he's a plant ecologist, and he does all kinds of studies on ecology, the classification and management of ecosystems, focusing particularly on rare plant species. He's got his PhD from Michigan State University and his bachelor's in biology from Western Michigan University. Uh, Tyler, thanks so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to your talk today.
Cool. Thanks, Barb. I think you heard Barb mentioned I'm going to turn off the video, well, because it just happened again. My internet just blinked out. So I'm gonna now you know what I look like. I'm gonna keep talking. So yeah, so you could probably tell from the introduction that is everybody seeing the screen, first of all? We good, Barb?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Cool, cool. Excellent. So yeah, the title of this talk is "To be rare is to be precious," and I put the question mark there as a sort of a potential counterpoint because it's really a talk about what does it mean, what is a rare species? What does that mean to be a rare species, and what do we do about that? How do we navigate that? Um, and so okay, there we go. There we go. Sorry. Just making sure everything works. So I will be looking at that through the lens of something that I am intimately familiar with, which is the rare plant species of Michigan. And so the overarching topic is, exploring the science and the philosophy of rarity, mostly the science, but I'll couch it in the philosophy a little bit. And this is what you're seeing on the screen there is just a bunch of random pictures that I grabbed of rare plant species in Michigan. So when I look at this, this is my world. This is what I'm used to seeing every day, my existence. And so first I'll talk about Michigan Natural Features Inventory, just to put it in context. So we work through Michigan State University Extension. And again, there's Michigan Natural Features Inventory. We work also in a network called NatureServe that holds data, the kind of data I'll be talking about, and collaborates with rare species science, all around the world in all the places depicted here on the screen. So we're doing what we're doing in Michigan, but it's connected to this big old network that is global. Our mission is to guide the conservation of Michigan's biodiversity by providing the highest quality scientific expertise and information. Kind of dry, but it's true. It's what we do. I feel like it's pretty accurate. And the main way we do it is through the Michigan Natural Heritage Database, which is depicted in all its glory there on the screen. So that's what it looks like when I open up the screen to interact with the database. It's a bunch of dots on the map that represent rare species observations. Go. Hang on a sec. There it goes. So in that database, there are over 25,000 records of rare plants, animals, and exemplary, high quality examples of natural communities or ecosystems. So it's a lot of data. It's spatial data and tabular data. We collect a lot of it, but a lot of it comes from amateurs and other professional scientists. So we actively recruit information from whoever wants to submit it, and then we vet it. And so the data comes from a lot of places. Okay, so that's the background of the world in which I'm working. So these are the points I'm going to address in the talk. So first of all, what do I mean by rarity and why should we care? And so that's sort of the question mark in the title. To be rare is to be precious. I mean, who cares? Why should it matter? And then I'll get into, how do we the sort of nitty-gritty science of how do we put labels on rarity, and then I'll talk about how we actually in the trenches, how do we make decisions about which species are rare and some of the implications of that. So first of all, what is rarity? Why should we care? So first of all, we hear a lot about species extinctions. It's it's in many of our faces all the time. So this extinction crisis is most acute in these biodiversity hotspots. There's currently 36 official biodiversity hotspots globally, and those places get a lot of attention, and they should because they are high concentrations of biodiversity. And then when you look at the IUCN's Red List, there's a lot of species that have been assessed and, 47,187. That's a pretty big number in terms of species that are threatened with extinction globally. So, however, those biodiversity hotspots are important, but there are rare species everywhere humans have impacted the earth, which you might not be surprised to find out is everywhere on the earth. And so that's why laws like the Endangered Species Act in the US, was passed in 1973, spurred on by concerns about this patriotic creature here, the bald eagle, which kind of capture the imagination of that crisis. But maybe you've noticed the little teeny tiny butterfly up at the corner too. It's not just the bald eagle, it's a bunch of teeny tiny things that nobody's ever heard of as well. And that's a Pauschik skipperling, one of the rarest butterflies in the eastern US. So we have a federal Endangered Species Act, and then we have state protections in Michigan. Not every state has their own Endangered Species Act, but we definitely have protected species in Michigan. And it's the Michigan Department of Natural Resources is in charge of enforcing that law, and then the United States Fish and Wildlife Service is in charge of enforcing the Endangered Species Act for the country. They interpret and enforce those laws. What MNFI and our colleagues do is we provide the expertise and the data that underpin the enforcement of those laws. So that's how kind of we fit into the big picture of it. Okay. So why are species rare? And perhaps why should we care? So this image right here could be the entire answer. I could just stop here and just say, hey, it's the impacts that people have had on the planet when this kind of land use is on the land. There's not much room for biodiversity, right? So the world used to look a lot like this, at least in North America, just 200-300 years ago, most of it was pretty undeveloped and quote unquote wild, inhabited by people, but also relatively unimpacted. So places that used to look like this now look like this, right? And places that used to look like this now look like this. And you can kind of it's a simple story. There's not much biodiversity in scenes like this. Also, focusing in on Michigan, but this is also true of everywhere that's been, colonized by Europeans, basically. The world was composed of, prior to that time, the world was composed of mostly natural land cover. If you want to check out this map, there's one for a lot of states. This is a snapshot of circa 1800 what the vegetative land cover was prior to widespread European colonization in Michigan. And in addition to just being a wild place, it was full of people that were managing the land in a particular way. In Michigan, there was several indigenous tribes that were managing the land for their purposes and interacting with the land in a specific way. And that's not pretty much not happening anymore. So those are the kind of changes that have led to the losses of biodiversity. And everything else you hear about is also going on in the background, but I'm not going to get bogged down in that with climate change and insect declines, invasive species. That's all going on too, but that's not really the point of what I'm here to talk about today. Um, and to round it out with why should we care, I like to emphasize that extinction is forever. And so we have a mentality in a lot of our society that we can just sort of have a technological fix for all our problems. We'll figure it out. If we screw it up, we'll just re-engineer the function or whatever we screwed up. Um, but ecosystems are far more complicated than even the best science understands. We're still just scratching the surface. And I like to look at rare species as canaries in the coal mine for the fate of other species, for the fate of ecosystems, and just landscapes overall. Um, this fact is enough to motivate me to care that extirpations, which is like a local extinction, and in real extinctions, they have an impact because I believe that every species has an intrinsic value to exist in the place where they evolved. And in addition to that, though, they often have very specific utility for humans. We're, always hearing about some new drug that was, synthesized from something that a plant was able to produce on its own. So like that stuff, we're losing those opportunities as well. If that's important to motivate folks. And I think about ecosystems as a sweater, and a lot of them are getting pretty ragged. And as you pull away at those threads, you're becoming more threadbare. The sweater just not, it's holding together. It's kind of right now, there's a lot of holes in it, but eventually if you pull enough threads, the sweater will fall apart. And that's what the work I do and all my colleagues, that's essentially what we're trying to hold the sweater together. And because each one of the species that's lost, the way it interacts with the other species is important. And when you lose those interactions, the uh, the whole thing can fall apart. So we're trying to avoid that if at all possible, against all odds, I suppose. Okay, so that's my sort of soapbox about what is rarity and some of the reasons why we might be motivated to care if we don't already. What's the science of it? How do we classify it? So, you know, I think a lot of people just think that there's a wizard up in a tower making these decisions like, oh, these are the rare species and these are not the rare species. Yeah, this is sort of my little joke about, oh, here's the Michigan Threatened and Endangered Species list, and it's a wizard in the tower making those decisions. But of course it's not. So let's look at what that list is. So first of all, in Michigan, this is the breakdown for rare animal species at the current time. And so we have 21 federally listed animal species, including the Mitchell satyr that's over on the right, which Barb knows well. She's done a lot of work with that species. So that's the Federal Endangered Species Act. And then below that line, we have what we refer to as state listed or state tracked species. The first one is special concern. Those don't have any protections. Those are just like a watch list, we like to call it. So those are species that are kind of getting rare, and if we don't do something about it, they might go below that dotted line, which is the protected species. They might be rare enough to be considered threatened, endangered, or they might be entirely extirpated from Michigan. So that's the sort of breakdown for animals, and here's the corresponding breakdown for plants currently in Michigan. So about a quarter of the species that we consider rare are that special concern, and then three-quarters are actually have legal protection under the Michigan Endangered Species Act. It's interesting to point that that total for plants, 451, that represents about a quarter of Michigan's native plant species. So that I find a somewhat, sobering fact that a quarter of the species that do or used to call Michigan home are at some risk of extinction, of local extinction or extirpation. Um, we classify rarity in lots of different ways. This is just a screenshot of MNFI's rare plant list, just the first few, and you'll see there's a federal status, a state status, a global rank, and a state rank. So how does that all play together? So first of all, a couple slides ago, I was talking about, threatened, endangered, extirpated, special concern. That is a legal definition. So those are terms that refer to, like, how do we treat this legally? If there's an impact on a threatened or endangered species, there may be legal ramifications. So that's comes down to laws specifically. However, as a conservation professional, we have this entire other way of thinking about rarity of species that includes all species. So it steps outside of just that list of rarity. So every species, well, most, they should have a global rank and a subnational rank, so a G and an S. And that's supported by data on populations, threats, and trends of those species. So a global rank says, how is this species doing overall, globally? And then the subnational rank is sort of my wheelhouse, is how is this species doing within the boundaries of, in what I'll be talking about is the state of Michigan. So let's look at a breakdown of all the plant species in Michigan. So that G5, that big purple section of the pie is what we refer to as globally secure. So these are the species, this is the 451 species that we consider rare in Michigan. The vast majority of them, as you can see, are secure in they're not likely to go extinct globally. There's only 5 species that we consider rare in Michigan that are at that sort of that crucial point. They're critically imperiled. They're really, really, really rare globally, and we have most of the populations in the state of Michigan. So it's a small proportion. And here's sort of the rest of the breakdown. You can see the pie chart. Those are the numbers that go with it. So G1, those are the critically imperiled species. G2, imperiled, so still a high risk. G3 is vulnerable, like well, I don't know, like definitely rare, but not that critically. And then G4 is we're pretty sure it's secure, and then G5 is secure. There's there's species that are constantly needing to be assessed, and there's always some that we haven't gotten around to giving a rank yet. Moving to the subnational, sort of zooming in on Michigan, all the species that we track in Michigan and consider rare are at, at most S3. So, and you can sort of see the breakdown. A bunch of them are S1s and S2s, which is critically impaired and imperiled. It's a parallel terminology to the G ranks. So, and this is sort of the rest of the breakdown. Because we add species to the list now and again, we don't always have time and haven't gotten around to providing that S rank. So we have several that are, S in R, which is we just haven't ranked them yet, but they're probably going to be a 1 or 2 or a 3. And then there's a bunch that are probably extinct, which is the SH ones. So we call those historical. They're probably not around anymore, but we haven't quite verified it. And then there's 60 species, at least 60 species in Michigan we're pretty sure they're gone from the state of Michigan, and they're not going to be rediscovered at anytime soon, or at all. So before I get into the next section, I want to emphasize some things about conservation overall, and these are sort of some trends in conservation. A lot, because I'm talking about rare plants today. That's what I know. That's what I love. A lot of conservation is driven by federally listed animals. And so a lot of the dollars, a lot of the management effort goes to support populations of the rarest animals. And so like the Mitchell Sater butterfly is a species of what we call fens. And so a lot of fen management is funded through supporting Mitchell Sater, but it benefits ton of plants too, and a ton of other animals. Same thing with the Carter blue butterfly in the bottom, which grows in savannas, and a lot of rare plant and animal species are associated with it. So it all just kind of goes together sometimes. However, that's not because there are more rare animals. So there's nearly 1,000 plant species listed on the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and that's more than half, if you lump all the plant and animal species together, more than half of them are plants. They just don't get they are just not charismatic enough or whatever. So they don't capture the interest. And in part because when you manage for an animal, you're often bringing things under the umbrella, but it's a little bit out of whack. And if you look at the plant species that we track in Michigan specifically, again, about a quarter of our flora, they're not given much attention in terms of conservation priorities. We have this wildlife action plan, and it drives a lot of conservation priorities, and they're not really considered in that. For a while there, we were looking at something called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It almost got voted on right before COVID kicked in, and then it's sort of been, I don't see it happening under this administration. So at some point, we may get some additional support where we can spend conservation money specifically on rare plant species. So. Okay, let's take another look at what the wizard's up to. So try to try to pull back the curtain a little bit and say, hey, what does it mean to be rare? How are we making these decisions about this thing is rare as opposed to that thing? So with plant species, I'm going to put it in four different bins basically. The first one is it's just range limited. What do I mean by that? So I'll be showing a slide like this for a bunch of different species to kind of explore some of these ideas. You can see, and if you find Michigan around the Great Lakes there, you can see that the range of this prairie trillium just barely tucks into the southwest corner of the state of Michigan. It's a pretty secure thing in eastern North America. It's pretty abundant to the south. A lot of species that we consider rare in Michigan fit this category. So it's just on the very edge of its range. Um,
Tyler, can I interrupt you for a second?
Absolutely.
Can you put your cursor over
Oh,
Michigan for those
thanks.
who are on the call that might not know exactly where we are?
Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, here, can we see it right now? Can we see the cursor?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, here we are in Michigan. So I'm talking about this spot. When I'm doing these Zoom things, I forget I have a cursor that you can see. So I'll be showing a bunch of these maps, and basically, if the state is green, that means the species occurs in it. If the county is green, that means it's in the state, but it's not rare in that state. If the counties where the species occurs in that state are yellow, that means that it's considered rare in that state. So that's the long and short of these maps. They're really useful to look at a glimpse, and you can another QR code if you want to check out the Biota of North America program. So, Okay, so range limited, I could give you tons of examples of that, but it's a pretty simple story. We also have disjunct populations. So species that the core of their range is somewhere else on the continent, and then there's a gap in the distribution, and then whoop, we see it shows up in Michigan. Some of my favorites, and there's a ton of these, are these Atlantic coastal plain disjunct species. So you can see, and I could show a similar map for, I don't know, a few dozen species that they occur mostly along the Atlantic coastal plain, and then there's a gap, and then they show up again, usually around southern Lake Michigan, right here. And that's likely because historically, when the oceans were higher, they kind of filled up in the Mississippi drainage, and there was a lot more connectivity between the Atlantic coastal plain and the Great Lakes region. That's the most likely explanation for that. Another disjunction that is kind of fascinating is there's a bunch of species that are common in the sort of western prairies, the montane regions of the West. And then there's this gap, and then oop, this guy just shows up in four counties in northern Michigan. This is one of the more extreme examples, but there's a bunch of them. And that probably just has to do when 15,000 years ago, when glaciers were pulling back north or receding from the continent, species were following them along. And then as the climate changed, it became less suitable for those species. And except for in this species case, just four counties in northern Michigan right here, where it seems to be fairly happy, but kind of rare. Some species are just rare. They're globally rare or just globally vulnerable. So one of the examples that I like to emphasize is the species Hill's thistle, which is relatively common in parts of Michigan, but as you can see, every state that it occurs in has the yellow counties, which means it is considered rare everywhere it occurs. And here's a glimpse at how the nature serve distribution. Those S ranks, we have all these yellow ones. That's S3, so considered vulnerable, and in a few places considered critically imperiled. So it's just rare everywhere it's found. In Michigan, it's relatively common in this part, in the northern lower peninsula. And that is in part, I'm sort of sprinkling in some of how does conservation happen here and there throughout this talk. So that's what this is an example of. This is a part of the state that has mostly public ownership. So here's National Forest in the blue. Here's State Department of Natural Resources in the yellow, and then there's some Fish and Wildlife Service lands in purple. So this is where that species occurs in Michigan, and because there's so much public land ownership, it has a solid foothold, and because this is its habitat, and if you've ever been to northern Lower Peninsula, Michigan, this is what it looks like. It just from one side of the to the other, it looks like that, and that's why our little hill sisal is so happy there. So another intrinsically rare thing is the federally and state threatened Houghton's goldenrod, and so this is a species that is mostly restricted to this little stretch around what we call the Straits region of Michigan, the Straits of Mackinac, and this little thing between the two peninsulas, very limestoney. It's a part of what's called the Niagara Escarpment, which starts over at the Niagara Falls and arches over here, and it sort of that's the distribution of several species. They just kind of really settled in along that Niagara Escarpment of limestone. So those are two examples of intrinsically rare species. Now, the fourth category that I'm talking about is what I'm referring to as taxonomic upheaval. So I could sort of glibly refer to that as when we invent species, sometimes they're rare. So we don't invent species, of course, but people called taxonomists who look at the differences between two species sometimes are like, oh, This one species is actually two, and one of them is super rare. And that's one of the things that recently happened a couple times in Michigan. So if you look on the right here, that original map of Houghton's goldenrod, you'll see there's these two counties show that it occurs there. But if you look at the MNFI database, they're not there anymore. And that's a kind of a curious thing. And here's Douglas Houghton, who Houghton's goldenrod is named after, looking down and thinking, hey, what's the deal with that? Where's my Houghton's goldenrod? And that's because these folks very recently, back in 2010, decided through science that the populations of Houghton's goldenrod there are a different species, now called Voss's goldenrod, named after sort of the modern godfather of Michigan botany, Ed Voss, who's just recently passed. But he's done more for the Michigan flora than anybody probably. And so it looks a lot like Houghton's goldenrod. It's a little bit bigger in some ways, but it is restricted to this little area, and it is one of the only truly endemic species we have in Michigan. The other truly endemic species also was kind of separated from a more common thing. That was a little bit long ago, back in 2003, but fairly recently. So this is what we call Michigan monkey flower. So those are our two truly endemic species in Michigan, found nowhere else in no other state or province. So there's not a whole lot of that's what we call endemism, right? So that there's not a whole lot of endemism in Michigan, and that's just because there hasn't been much time for species to differentiate from each other because this big thing called a glacier was covering Michigan only 15,000 years ago. So that's not a whole lot of time for species to differentiate from each other and speciate. So that is in other places where that weren't covered in glaciers for thousands and millions of years. There's been a lot more time for evolution to do its thing. So again, these are the four ways that I think about why is a species rare. Some of it's just because of the political boundaries, and some of it is because the fundamental biology of the species. So now I want to bring the discussion to the question. So we're considering these rare species, rare enough to be the focus of our work, and we're interested in documenting where they occur and understanding their biology and ecology. So they're important, but are they truly rare, or do we just not have enough information about where they occur? So that sums up what I do more than anything else. So let's look at the changing face of rarity. Again, we're gonna have to consult the wizard because it's a wizard up in a tower apparently making all these decisions. But no, I'm pulling back the curtain. So if you go back to 1973, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, a lot of states followed suit after that, and in Michigan, the first sort of cohesive list was published in May of 1977. Like these are the ones that the experts at the time thought were the rarest things. If you look at the distribution here, um, you know, a big chunk of them were considered threatened. They had some special concern, very few endangered. They had 326 species on the list. That list has been scrutinized and edited and changed a few times in those years. The most recent time was in 2023, which landed us with the 451 species that are now on what we just call the list sometimes, and that's the distribution there. So of those 326 species, most of them are still on the list. Most of them, the ones that were thought to be rare in 1977, are still thought to be rare in 2020. We're in 2023 and now. 79 of them have been removed, and then we've added a bunch more that we've either declining, or we just sort of realized are rarer than we thought. And I'm going to go through each of these bins and sort of deconstruct how they have changed over time and kind of what that means, kind of how the sausage gets made is one way to express that. So, of the 79 species or taxa, which includes varieties and such, some were delisted, some were decided that they weren't actually native. We use the word adventive or non-native. Some changed because of their taxonomy of the group they're in changed, and there's some that I'm not really sure how to classify them. So let's look at the ones that were actually delisted. They were actually removed from the list because we think they're less rare. So I'm just sort of going to go through this, show you an example of a plant for each of the things I'm talking about here, to sort of shine a light on just the myriad different ways that we can change the status of a species. It's not always because it's more rare or less rare. It's just we have our data set has changed basically. So here's a species that was considered special concern from 1977 until 1987, when started getting way like more observations of it and realized, oh, this thing isn't as rare as we thought it was. It's probably moving north from southern states. So this is one that its biology is driving its delisting. It's just expanding north into more and more parts of the state. Here's a gorgeous, probably one of the most charismatic plants I've ever seen in my life. I love this one called American Columbo. This was considered special concern for a while, but I think it's not expanding its range. People just found more, reported more occurrences of it. So it's still restricted to the rare habitat that it's found in, but there's just more of it than we thought there was. Let's look at a couple taxonomic issues or situations. So here's a species that was known from only one collection in Michigan, and hadn't ever been seen since. So we right out the gate we're like, oh, this one's gone. This one is extirpated from the state. Then taxonomists took a look at this genus Sisyrinchium and realized, you know what, that Sisyrinchium hastili, that's not a species. That actually that's associated with this very common thing. So that one got taxonomized out of existence. Here's another example where this hybrid fern was considered rare, but then as science progressed, we realized it's not really, you can't really consider it viable because it's sterile. It can't reproduce, so that doesn't really that's not grounds for calling a thing rare. It's just something that happens every once in a while when those two species hybridize. Okay, so those are some examples of how species have been removed from the list, and every time we do this assessment, examples like that, similar to those, show up. So some of the species, let's look at the ones that we still think are legitimately rare. And so between 77 and 2023, some have been uplisted, considered less rare, downlisted, considered more rare. Some haven't changed. So let's look at some of the downlisted species, ones that, went from endangered to threatened to special concern. What's the deal with it? So here's a species called dwarf bulrush that was threatened for a while and was demoted, if you will, to special concern. We just got better data. So that's just as species sometimes get delisted because we have more observations and better data. This is sort of like the typical way that these changes happen. Here's an atypical way. Here's a bunch of different Cuscuta species or daughters where it said, oh, these are definitely threatened. But very quickly, the state legislature stepped in and said, no, all of those are noxious weeds. So they're considered noxious weeds. That's what this purple is on the map. And so they can't be legally protected, even though they're super duper rare. Some with only one or two known populations, they still can't be legally protected because they're part of a group of plants that are considered an agricultural nuisance. So that's kind of a goofy twist on things. And then we have species like the snow trillium, which was considered extirpated, but then was rediscovered and then became threatened. I wonder if it's going to be endangered soon because it's got some issues. So that's sort of the storyline for that species. What about some of the species that we think are actually more rare than they were back then? So here's a little tale I'm going to tell about this guy, World Begonia. It's gotten considered more rare, special concern to threatened. Um, and I'll peek behind the curtain and just tell you this little vignette to show you how we interact with the status of these species and what it means in real life. And so, as of 2019, there were 18 known occurrences of it. Seven of those had recent information and were what we call confirmed extant. And so you saw in that graph, I had, it was organized by EO rank. So I talked about the G rank. There's also an N rank for species, which we don't need to talk about, but it's there. There's an S rank, which is the subnational status I've been discussing. And then at the population level, we assign what we call an EO rank. So each of the occurrences of these species is referred to as an EO or an element occurrence. And so that's an A through D rank. So A is excellent, B good, C fair, D poor, like in bad shape. There's also these other categories we have to put things in. E means it hasn't been ranked. F means we looked for it but didn't find it. H means we don't have any current data. The data's 20 to 40 years old at least. And X means it's definite that population is definitely gone. So in 2019, one of the best populations of this species, one of the best EOs, was impacted by a bad decision. Basically, we'll put it that way. So in this stand on state land, a bunch of oak trees died. The forester called for what's called a salvage cut to like salvage those trees for forestry, and basically overlooked the environmental review that would have said, "Hey, there's a rare species there. You should take care." As a result of that action, they probably wiped out that population. It might come back, who knows? But we hate to see that. As a result, the DNR said, "Oh shoot, we made a mistake," and they paid for us to do a status survey of that species in Michigan. As a result of that, we confirmed 7 of the 18 and actually added one new population of the species to our database. And you can see these ranks here, over here, the A through D, they didn't change, that distribution didn't change very much, but we knocked this historical line down a bit by rediscovering a handful of populations that didn't have good data. And we also decided one of them was definitely gone. An additional vignette to show how these statuses play out in conservation is looking at prairie species in Michigan. So about a quarter of the plant species we track in Michigan are these upland prairie species, in part because of what you're seeing here. All this green was historical prairies and the related savannas and barrens. Now you have to squint to see most of what's left. And so therefore the species that rely on that habitat, they're generally in trouble. For your edification, this is a prairie vision. As you can see, this picture was taken in Indiana because we just don't have it anymore. We don't have big enough chunks in Michigan. Also, prairies aren't only threatened in Michigan, they're threatened globally. And as you can see, this paper from about 20 years ago, which said, hey, here's the most critical, endangered, and vulnerable biomes on the globe. the North American prairies here, it was definitely one of the most critically threatened. So, you know, the way we think about tropical rainforests, it's the, a different but same things going on with North American prairies. So there's quite a few of these prairie species that are definitely considered extirpated from Michigan. This is just one of several examples, so it's definitely gone. It was originally endangered, then maybe it's threatened, but yeah, we knew as of 1991 that the last populations were gone. So in order to understand just how bad the prairie flora had gotten, these two intrepid individuals, myself and Brad Slaughter, conducted a status survey for these five species that kind of represent those upland prairie systems in Michigan. So, and they had a variety. Some were special concern, some were threatened. We suspected that they were worse off than those categories suggested. And after a few years of survey, we came up with these answers. So basically, across the board, you can see of the populations that we surveyed, anywhere between 11 and 66% were still there, we're still extant. As a result of that, this is sort of if you look on the top there, this one is still special concern. This one was uplisted to threatened. This one was uplisted to endangered. So this is telling the tale. This is using this natural heritage data to tell the story, to scope back out and tell a story of an entire biome or ecosystem through the status of these species. There's a bunch that haven't changed at all, and just because I like looking at pictures of plants, you may not know these or care about these species, but I'm just going to click through a bunch of these things, not really tell their story. But they're in the same status as they were in 1977. So some are still special concern. There's a ton that are still threatened, across all different types of plants. There's a ton that are still endangered, and there's a ton that we didn't have any modern records of in 1977, and we still don't. They're probably gone. Plenty of examples of that. Then there's a handful that are new on the list as I close in on this story. And it's in part because we just have better data than ever. We have people out there looking for these things, iNaturalist, etc. We're getting a lot of people out there. So to summarize the changes that were made in the most recent update to the list, we took 13 that had been considered special concern that are now either threatened, endangered, or extirpated. And we added 7 new species to the list. Some of them are probably because if we looked hard enough, we'd find them, which is one of the reasons to have a rare species list. We don't have good enough data, but you know what? If we put it on the list, people are going to pay attention and start looking for it and reporting it, and that happens a lot where we put a species on the list and we find out, it's not nearly as rare as we thought it was. We just haven't been reporting it. Some are added to the list because of habitat degradation, fire suppression in this shining wedge grass on the right, forest, too much timber cutting in this blue-eyed Mary on the left. And then there's a bunch that just had been overlooked, which is hard to believe, but there's tons of wildlands that have not been traversed, or the right person wasn't there at the right time. These tend to be truly rare in the state. Some examples there. There's examples like this there where taxonomy intervened. It's separated from, the Viridis stellata was separated from the Cryptolepis. And, we have a very rare species now. That happens over and over again. There's species like this carex here that, as you can see right here, pretty common to the south of us. It could be expected to creep up into Michigan, and eventually it was found. Another example of a species that doesn't have a very contiguous distribution, a truly rare species that that because people are out there looking, this one was found through an iNaturalist post. So somebody was just out there and like, oh, holy crap, this is a really rare thing, and put it on iNaturalist, and it got to us that way. So these are cool discoveries that you don't expect to happen. Truly rare species showing up in your state. And here's one that is based upon a specimen of, so this resembles a very common species of aster called large leaf aster. At some point, somebody who is an expert with the asters took another look at this specimen, which was from the 1820s, I believe, and said, oh, actually, that's that's not Eurybia macrophylla, that's Eurybia schreberi. And so we have this immediately extinct species with one observation now in Michigan. So something to look out for. All right, to sum up that whole saga, here's here's this image again. So, most of the species that were considered rare in 1977 are still considered rare. We've removed some and we've definitely added some. And then looking at this comparative figure here. So we've added to the sort of the proportion that we think are probably extinct. So, yep, that's a barometer of how are Michigan plants doing. More are probably are we think are going extinct or extirpated from the state. More are endangered. As we get to the less critical categories, similar amounts of threatened and special concern. But this part of it is sort of, hey, this is telling us we know things are, these species and these habitats are under attack, but this is sort of the data that actually tells the story. So, which is zooming back out to the globe. I mean, you know that's kind of what everything is telling us, but this is my sort of view from the sort of the corner of the world that I'm working in. That's how the data that's how the data that we curate and collect supports our understanding of the world. So I had a couple more slides if I had time, but I think this is a fine time to stop, and I'd love to answer some questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Tyler. That was fascinating, depressing, interesting, all at once.
Yes, yeah. I try not to be too big of a bummer, but
It's kind of hard with the subject matter, that's for
yep,
sure.
for sure.
Um, I wanted also, if folks have questions, please raise your hands. And we have some questions in the chat,
Mhm.
um, and we could go through those. I can scroll up here. So, Eric, I don't know if Eric, you want to ask the question. I'd like you to let Tyler know where you're from so he has a sense of the audience today. We usually do that at the beginning, and I neglected
Mhm.
to do that. So,
So I'm on the eastern shore of Lake Huron. It's
Mm.
a little place called Southampton, Ontario. It's not the place the Titanic sailed from, so just letting you
Huh.
know that.
Cool.
I had actually three questions, but one of them is going to be long and involved. The first one is just how often do you do the rarity assessment?
Yeah. So it's somewhat sporadic, basically. So the legal part of the process, it's supposed to happen every 5 years, basically. Um, by law, that's what the law states, but it's not a very well enforced part of the law. So technical committees do meet every 5 years to review those, threatened, endangered, it's especially, etc. And then they hand it up to the DNR, and the DNR takes it up to the legislature. Those later steps don't always happen, but they do get reviewed every 5 years. They just don't. The law doesn't change every time. Yep.
Okay, you're also talking about survey sites. How do you pick a survey site? How do you say, oh, this is a good place to look?
Oh gosh. Uh, so I'll try to be brief. The way Michigan Natural Features Inventory works is we don't have any discretionary funding. And so we work entirely through contracts and grants. And so we develop projects with partners in addition to, going after traditional grants. And so it's usually based upon a conversation with a partner who is, in the DNR or the, Forest Service or whoever. Um, so it's kind of willy-nilly in a sense. And so we 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 use our knowledge of which parts of the landscape are undersurveyed or which things that we think are under threat or need more research or something. But it's a case by case basis. We're what's called a natural heritage organization. Like I said at the beginning, there's one in every state, every province and territory. Other ones do have discretionary funding, and they probably use a very structured way of doing that, but we don't have that. No.
So Janet Livingston has got a question for you.
Sure.
Is
See
Janet
that?
still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm in north central Texas in a tiny little town called Rome, which is in
All right.
Wise County.
Mhm.
And I would like to know what apps you would suggest for identifying plants. I'm currently using iNaturalist and PlantNet.
Yeah, those are good ones. Yeah, iNaturalist uses the Seek app, which I think is probably the best one. I'm not super aware of all the apps because I don't use them. Um,
Okay.
but my understanding is that yeah, iNaturalist it's good because they all depend upon how much data there. I mean, how many observations that are like feeding into the algorithm. And I think iNaturalist is just it's so many observations. So it just keeps on getting better and better too. So,
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I also use Picture This, which is another good one.
okay,
Okay, thank
cool. Um,
I had one question for you, Tyler.
sure.
I was at a wetland training a couple, 2, 3 years ago, and
Hmm.
led by Tony Resnicek. And of course, I can't remember exact location. We were in Ann Arbor at one of the parks. The highway came through there was a bridge over the park. You probably know about this site. The scupper drains that drain the road stormwater come down the abutment, and it's on the edge of, I think it was on the edge of a river, but the
Hmm.
salt that came through the scupper drains from the road created an environment there, a little micro environment. And the
Hmm.
plants that grow there are ones from salt marshes on the Atlantic coast.
Yeah.
And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I'm assuming all of the seeds that came for those plants came in on
Yeah.
vehicles that got washed down the scupper drain into that spot. And I'm wondering about modern, like the distribution of plants, um, creation of new disjunct populations because of
Hmm.
human transportation. We see that, of course, with invasive species, but
Hmm.
I'm wondering about how frequent that type of thing might happen. Certainly, it's not sustainable. If you take the bridge away, you don't have the
Yeah.
salt input, and that's that. But
Yeah, I think it is definitely happening with increasing frequency, just because there's more of us moving around at higher rates.
mhm.
Um, yeah, it can be in the situation you described, that's pretty discreet and clear. Like we can surmise the story there. There's other examples where we're not sure, right? And so for example, there's a handful of species that we're tracking as special concern that, you know, we're starting to get more and more observations, and we're like, is this is this really native here? Or, you know, was it undiscovered for a while, or it's just showing up in high quality habitats sometimes.
Mhm.
But the narrative, if you look through time of the species, you're like, oh, why is it increasing in abundance all of a sudden? Like, did the world change or or what, you know? So
Yeah.
yeah, most of the examples you told the story perfectly. You like put it in the box that it probably belongs in, but there's other examples where it's real difficult.
Mhm.
But that's why we put them on the list, honestly, so that people will go looking for them,
Sure.
and help us make those decisions.
Um, Cosmos says in the chat, greetings from Vienna, Austria.
Greetings.
And Eric has another question: is the role of biodiversity in prairie
Yeah,
restoration
yeah,
yours?
yeah. That's my dissertation. Indeed.
Um, and Commander Webb, did you want to ask your question
Ooh,
or talk, or do you
that's
want
a lot of delicious detail.
to? So he says in the chat, um, he and a few other native plant advocates in Georgia are undertaking conservation efforts for an S1 rare wildflower Alabama warbonnet, James Zeanthus alabamensis.
That's a
I've,
cool name.
I've had good experience with the plant for the past 2 years and hope for a third positive year in 2026. Any thoughts on how we can better report our successes and failures to state regional authorities? We continue to report via
Mm.
our local extension agents and a few web portals.
Um, Personal relationships. That's trying to get to know some of the people that are making the important decisions. And I don't know, every state works different. But every state has a natural heritage program. And so if you're, developing it, maybe you're already working with those folks, but I think, um, actually calling them up or emailing, folks that do what I do are passionate. Like, we do it because we really, really care about rare species and are generally always looking for partners and collaborators in these things. So I think reaching out to the, you know, Georgia Natural Heritage Program, I'm not familiar with any of the folks there, but I'm assuming they're as passionate as I am. Um, and yeah, getting to know, like asking some questions about how, like all the things I was describing about how this works in Michigan. It works similarly, but some other way in Georgia. And I think, um, yeah, building the relationships with the people who actually know about it and make those decisions is because um, that amplifies what you're doing because they're in the trenches. So,
And I just posted a link to George's
oh,
heritage
good.
program in the chat box
Thanks.
there.
Cool.
Eric had another question. Eric's got great questions.
Well, I got home from work at 3 a.m. So it's like I got out the computer and we did a basic web search, put your name
Hmm.
in and said um, dissertation, and then I spent a few minutes looking to that, despite the fact that my knowledge of botany is primitive, let's say. So in your dissertation, you talk about you're getting your data from 28 different grassland restoration sites
Yep.
in southwest Michigan. And one of them you say, contrary to expectations, diversity was negatively correlated with all three measures of stability. That would be the resistance and resistance and resilience to droughts
Yep.
and temporal stability. And I keep expecting to see a DeLorean come in with that one, or a like a phone booth or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So the question that I had for that, with that being the lead in, was: have you had a chance to look at other biomes besides grasslands?
Hmm.
If you have, um, is this same correlation reflected there? And if you haven't, do you know of any other people doing similar work?
Tons. I mean, that was the reason it's a surprise is because pretty much in any other system, ecosystem, or group of species that are studied, the vast majority of that body of theory says, the higher diversity, the more stable an ecosystem is.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's tons of data that support it. Some of it's experimental, some of it's observational, but that's why that result was so, you know, had so much of a head scratcher.
And
And so,
counterintuitive, right?
yes, very counterintuitive, and there is a just a so much in it, and it's ongoing. I mean, those data are over a decade old at this point. But like even since then, it's just the train's kept going, and it seems to still support the importance of diversity. There's diversity isn't a thing. It's a concept that we you know it isn't one thing, I guess. It's sometimes it's the number of species, sometimes it's the number of species interactions. There's so many ways you can actually measure diversity, and the way you measure it can make a big impact on what what it says in that ecosystem. So yeah. Yeah. The reason I think we found that outcome is the ecosystem we were studying is prairies. We use the word restored because that's the term people use, but really the term is reconstructed. They're young ecosystems. I mean, they were, maybe up to a decade or a little bit more old from being farm fields. Basically, they were, seeds that were planted in former agricultural fields. And so versus an ecosystem that evolved over centuries or millennia, through natural processes, it's it's the dynamics in a planted prairie are probably very different than a natural ecosystem. So it's just not, it hasn't reached anywhere near equilibrium is probably why I think we found that. But there's
So
other
yeah.
there's other similar systems that have found the opposite, that are a lot like what we were studying, that found, that positive relationship. So hard telling.
One of the things that I think I might have talked with you before about this, Tyler, when there's restoration projects going on, and the um, sometimes geographical isolation of these sites. I'm thinking of wetland mitigation sites, for instance, and I've thought
Mhm.
about this with wild rice restoration, where places that we planted wild rice, it'll come up, but it's so heavily browsed. And if you look
Mhm.
at the landscape, that particular wetland is the only wetland for quite a ways around. So it's
Right.
attracting the animals that need it. You get, I
Yeah.
would think, heavier browsing pressure because that's the only place for them to go. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, with other types of restorations for prairies and such, is connectivity considered in site location, or is it more of availability of land where they can do a restoration, or? Is that
Yeah, it is. It is the second for sure. It's
Mhm.
very. It depends on the landscape and the ownership. Um, I'd say that with prairie restoration, most of it is an individual landowner making a decision
Mhm.
um, on their land, and not they're not making that decision in the context of the larger landscape at all. That takes a lot of cooperation,
Yeah.
even amongst the some of the public land ownerships, which are bigger. Those decisions are generally not part of a bigger strategy, I think. There is a there's hopeful signs. People are just requires collaboration across jurisdictions, and there's a growing group movement in the northern lower called the National Northern Pine Plains Partnership, which is an attempt to, not necessarily through restoration somewhat, but through management, to co-manage across all those land ownerships. So there's hopefully that kind of thing will catch on, because I do think addressing any conservation concern is just strengthened so much by that connectivity. It just, like, species are trying to move around the landscape, and populations need to be sort of rescued sometimes by propagules from somewhere else, and that's just not possible in the dissected landscape, the fragmented world we live in. So
Right.
yeah, that's especially in a place like out west. Maybe there's a lot more connectivity in some places, but where we live, at least,
Mhm.
Barb, it's pretty chopped up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Any other questions for Tyler while we have him? I don't see anything else in the
Yeah,
chat.
it's in the chat.
Um, all right. Well, before I let you go, Tyler, I just want to announce to everybody our next Cell Speaker Series event is going to be on Saturday, December 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And it's a talk given by Dr. Nicole Zellner, who's a physics professor at Albion College, and she's also a NASA Solar System Ambassador. And her talk is going to be Early Earth, Maybe Not So Hadean After All. And it sounds like it's going to be an amazing talk about how theories of how life began here on the planet. So I'm looking forward to that one. So I hope you can join us. Tyler, thank you so much for
Yeah,
taking time out of your Saturday to come and talk
yeah.
to us about your amazing work and the plants here in Michigan. And
Hmm.
thank you for all the work that you have done and continue to do.
Cool. Thanks, Barb. Thanks for inviting me. This is a cool audience. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. And I hope everyone has a
Thank you
great
for being here.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, everybody. Well, have a great rest of your weekend.
Y'all
Take it
too.
easy.